I was 71 when I fell in love again. You'd think people my age would be allowed a little joy without everyone whispering. But my family, they didn't take it that way. My daughter rolled her eyes when I told her about Thomas. My sister laughed and said, "You should be buying rocking chairs, not romance." I smiled it off, but their words stung more than I'd admit. For once I wanted something for me. Not as a mother, not as a widow, but as a woman who still had dreams left to live. So when Thomas and I drifted apart, I didn't cry. I didn't chase him. I took the money I'd been saving for our future and bought myself a little cottage by the lake. They thought I'd lost love, but what I really found was freedom and peace, the kind no one can take from you. People ask me sometimes what a quiet life looks like after someone you love is gone. They imagine empty rooms and a slow march through each day, and there's truth to that. But there's more to it than just empty. There are routines that become talismans. The way the kettle clicks on at exactly 6 in the morning, the folded paper on the kitchen table with the crossword half finished in his handwriting, the spot on the porch where he always left his hat. Those things kept me company at first. They were familiar as breath. They made the house bearable. My name is Margaret Hollis, but everyone who knows me calls me Maggie. I taught 3rd grade for 32 years in a little school that smelled like crayons and apple polish, and when Henry died, people kept bringing food and saying the right things. They sat with me in the living room and told stories about him. The way he would bring donuts on a Friday, the awful fish stew he swore by, the time he tried to fix the old furnace with nothing but a wrench and stubbornness. I liked hearing those memories. They made him feel larger than the small cardboard box of his belongings on my kitchen counter. At night, though, the house spoke differently. It wasn't loud or mean. It just had this openness to it, as if the spaces between things had stretched. I would sit at the kitchen table after the dishes were done and listen to the refrigerator hum and the clock tick, and I sometimes felt like a person walking through a house that belonged to someone else. People tell you grief is a storm, but for me it was more like fog. You could move, but everything held a kind of distance. To keep from getting stuck in that fog, I did the things that kept me feeling anchored. I planted tomatoes in the raised beds Henry had built. There's a certain comfort in dirt under your nails and in the honest, slow math of tending something that expects you to show up. I went to my book club on Tuesday evenings, where we would sip lukewarm coffee and argue, politely, about character motivations and who had stolen whose plot device. I cooked for my daughter Claire on Sundays, a little tradition we'd kept. She'd come by with her kids when she could, and we'd pass casseroles around and fold towels together like it was another verse in a hymn. Claire is a good woman, busy in a way that makes me proud. She's a single mother, which means time is a scarce thing for her. She would call most evenings, quick texts with a string of emojis, and sometimes I would hear her voice on the phone and feel like the world made sense again. Still, as days stretched into months, those small comforts sometimes felt like fragile ropes. I wanted more than routine. I wanted a laugh that came easy, a voice that answered when I asked a silly question, someone who would roll their eyes with me about a bad show on television. I didn't expect to want companionship the way I had when Henry was alive. Not to replace him. Never that. But to feel seen again in a way that didn't involve tending to someone's illness or paperwork. A few months after the funeral, our church hosted a charity bake sale to raise money for the community pantry. I volunteered because it felt right. Sugar and serving spoons are good for the soul. And because being among people made the house feel smaller. That's where I met Thomas. He was standing by the table with a paper plate of brownies in his hand, offering them like a peace treaty. He had laugh lines at the corner of his eyes, and a voice as gentle as a hymn. He asked me with real interest about the jam I'd brought. He listened when I talked about the garden. He didn't try to one-up my stories or make them about himself. It's a small thing, I know, but it felt like the most unusual kindness. We spoke about the pantry, about small towns and big storms, about how the library really should get new lamps. He didn't rush through his sentences. He sat with what I said like it mattered. After that, we saw each other sometimes at the farmer's market, and occasionally at the church potluck. It happened slowly. Coffee after choir practice, a walk by the river on a Sunday afternoon, a gentle hand at the small of my back when I tried to step into a puddle. The other volunteers nodded at us like we were a proper, sensible thing, two people taking the day as it came. Thomas had been a school crossing guard when he was younger, and then worked at the hardware store. He knew about tools and old songs, and he liked to talk about morning light on the mountain. He never crowded me. He asked questions and waited for my answers. When people ask me what it felt like to feel alive again, it's hard to explain without sounding foolish. You carry all these small things in you. The way a favorite sweater keeps the shape of your shoulders. The way a dishware imprint marks your kitchen table. And suddenly there's another set of small things being made with you in mind. A call to ask if I've eaten that day, a text with a silly picture of a dog, a postcard from the hardware store showing a mail-order shovel he thought I might like. It wasn't fireworks. It was a steady, quiet warmth. The kind you feel when the sun hits your face in late afternoon. But I knew, even then, that the idea of it would unsettle my family. You'd be surprised how many people think a woman my age should fold herself into the background like afternoon curtains. There's a strange expectation that when you reach a certain age, life narrows into routine and remembrance. You get birthday cards that say, "Enjoy your retirement," as if retirement were supposed to be the last chapter and not a quiet turn into a different kind of going. So I kept the little sightings of Thomas to myself at first. A mention here, a joke there. I liked the private thrill of a shared glance over late-season tomatoes. Then one Sunday, after Claire had her children over and the house smelled like cinnamon rolls, I told her I had been going to the charity meetings with someone. Her pause on the other end of the phone lasted long enough for me to notice how the clock sounded louder than it had before. "What do you mean, someone?" she asked. And there was something behind her voice that I didn't understand yet. Not unkindness exactly, but a certain alarm. "It's just Thomas," I said. "He helps with the pantry. We walk sometimes. He's a good man, Claire." Another pause. "Mom," she said then, "are you sure this is a good idea? You know how these things go. You're 71. People will start talking." I smiled, the way you might smile at an overly earnest child. "I'm not interested in what people say, Claire. I'm interested in what feels right." "Is that so wrong?" She sighed, softer now. "I just don't want you to get hurt. The world can be cruel, Mom. I don't want you to be taken advantage of." She meant well. Her caution was parent protective, the same tone she'd taken when I was 16 and bent on cutting my own bangs, or when she'd first started dating and came home with a broken vase as a peace offering. But there was a trembling in her voice I didn't like, not of me, but of something she feared could be taken from her. Her mother's safety. After that call, I found myself folding napkins with more attention than usual, thinking of all the things that had been done for me in my life. I thought of Henry's steady hand and the way he trusted people easily. I thought of the quiet ways kindness can be misread for weakness. For a few days, I kept Thomas at the edge of my life, seeing him only at church events, letting myself enjoy the smell of his coat without naming it. Then one evening, he knocked at my door with a thermos of tea and a small loaf of bread wrapped in wax paper. "I thought you might like this," he said, and he looked genuinely pleased when I invited him in. We sat at my kitchen table and ate bread the way a child eats cake, slowly with small exclamations. He told me about a repair he'd done on a neighbor's fence, and I told him about a class of children who came to school the day after a storm, with mud in their shoes and bright, indomitable eyes. He listened. That's what I remember most. He listened as if the things I said unspooled something in him that wanted to be better. There was no rush to fix me or to tell me how to move on. He simply offered his company, and in the weeks after, the world softened. I looked forward to his notes, and to the way he would point out the first robin on my lawn in spring. It felt small and more real than a lot of the things that had promised so much and delivered little. There was fear, of course. It's foolish to say there wasn't. I worried about being judged, about the whispering that seems to gather in small towns the way fog gathers in valleys. I worried about hurting my daughter's feelings. But mostly I worried about being careless with the part of my life Henry had entrusted to me. His small, steady love. Loving again didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like permission to be human. I didn't tell many people. I kept my visits to the market and my walks by the river private. Small things that belonged to me. The mornings still had their rituals. The kettle, the crossword, the porch hat. But now there were also new rituals. A wooden spoon tapping against a pot as we made soup together. The click of his lighter when we sat on the porch in the early evenings. 2 mugs warming our hands. Every now and then, when the house settled and the radio hummed softly in the background, I would find myself surprised by a laughter that felt younger than the years I carried. When the first leaf of autumn fell into the yard and landed near Henry's bench, I felt a squeeze in my chest. I always notice the small things now. The way a light slants through the trees, the exact timbre of someone's chuckle. Maybe that's the thing about being older. You collect details like marbles and keep them in a jar for the cold nights. Thomas was becoming one of those marbles. I knew too that the idea of him would not sit well with everyone. But for the first time since Henry's funeral, I felt the steady thread of interest and the small, steady glow of companionship. And I allowed it to be mine. There's no fireworks in this kind of beginning. It's more a slow warming, like coals in a hearth that were smoldering and someone came along with a small breath and made them glow again. I kept that warmth to myself, not out of secrecy, but out of care. I wanted to see what it would be like when not observed, to know whether it was something true or a comfort I was clinging to out of loneliness. I had no way of knowing then how other people would see it. I only knew what it felt like inside me, and for the long afternoons and the soft evenings, that felt like enough. I remember the day I decided to tell them. It wasn't planned, not really. It just sort of slipped out in the middle of a Sunday lunch at Claire's house. The kind where the table's full of too much food. Laughter mixes with the sound of plates clinking, and the TV murmurs softly from another room. It was one of those afternoons when the air feels light, and for a moment, you believe everything is simple. I'd brought my usual casserole, chicken and wild rice, and Claire had made her famous peach cobbler. Her kids were running through the hallway, leaving a trail of half-eaten potato chips behind them, and my sister Ruth was perched on the couch, giving her opinion on every piece of furniture in sight. It was loud and warm, the kind of noise that makes a house feel alive again. And then, without thinking, I said it. I've been seeing someone. The room didn't go silent exactly, but it changed. The sound of the spoon scraping the bottom of the cobbler dish stopped. Claire looked up, blinking like she hadn't heard me right. Ruth raised her eyebrows and gave that little half-smile that meant she was ready to pounce on something interesting. Claire spoke first. "What do you mean seeing someone, Mom?" I smiled, keeping my voice even. "I mean, I've been spending time with a man. His name's Thomas. He's kind, thoughtful. You'd like him." There was a pause, and then Ruth laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not yet, but the kind that says, "Oh, that's adorable, and also impossible." "Maggie," she said, shaking her head. "What on earth do you mean a man? At your age?" I felt my cheeks warm. "At any age, Ruth, people still talk and eat and take walks. It's not like I've signed up for ballroom dancing." Claire sighed, setting down her fork. "Mom, are you serious about this? You barely know him. How do you even meet someone like that? You're 71. You can't just—" She trailed off, like she didn't know how to finish the sentence without sounding cruel. I looked at her, trying to read the worry behind her voice. "We met at church," I said simply. "He volunteers at the pantry. He's a good man." Ruth leaned back and gave a soft chuckle. "Oh, honey, men like that, they love a good story. They'll smile, they'll help you carry groceries, and then next thing you know, they're asking for your savings account number. You've got to be careful." Claire nodded in agreement, though her face softened when she looked at me. "Mom, I just don't want you to get hurt. These guys know women like you are lonely." Something in me went still at that word. Lonely. I had been lonely, yes, but hearing it said out loud like that, as if it were a weakness, a flaw carved into my skin, made me feel smaller than I wanted to admit. "I'm not lonely, Claire," I said quietly. "I'm living." No one spoke after that for a while. The kids' laughter echoed from another room, the sound of an old cartoon filling the silence. Ruth finally broke it, half whispering, "Well, if it keeps you busy, I suppose that's fine. Just don't get any ideas about moving in with him or something." I laughed softly, more to release the tension than out of amusement. "No one's moving anywhere," I said. "We're just getting to know each other." But their words didn't leave me. Even after I drove home that evening, the road humming beneath the tires and the sky dimming into purple, I could still hear Ruth's teasing voice and Claire's worried sighs. It felt like the sound of doubt settling in my chest. Still, the next morning, when Thomas called to ask if I wanted to join him for coffee at the diner, I said yes. His voice had a steadiness that I needed right then, a warmth that didn't question or analyze. When he smiled at me across that chipped formica table, I decided I wouldn't let anyone else's judgment tell me what I was allowed to feel. We kept meeting after that, sometimes at the park, sometimes by the river where he liked to feed the ducks. He had this gentle way about him, like every story I told mattered. He listened when I talked about Henry, my late husband. He didn't flinch at the name or try to compete with a ghost. That mattered more than I realized. One evening, after a long walk, he brought me home and lingered by the door. "You know," he said with a shy grin, "I didn't expect to find anyone like you." "Like me?" I asked, smiling. He shrugged. "Someone real. Someone who's not pretending to be younger than they are. Someone who still believes in good company." It was a nice thing to hear. Maybe I should have paid more attention to the way he said it. A little too practiced, maybe. But I didn't. I let it sit in my heart like a gift. For the first time in a long while, I started to dress up again. Not fancy, just small things. A new scarf, lipstick, a pair of pearl earrings I hadn't worn since Henry's retirement party. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, I saw someone softer, more alive. It wasn't about vanity. It was about feeling visible again. But word travels fast in small towns, and it wasn't long before the whispers reached me. At church, I overheard someone murmur, "Isn't that Maggie Hollis with that widower fellow? She's glowing lately." There was laughter afterward, the kind that hides judgment in politeness. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself people would always talk, that I'd spent my whole life worrying about other people's comfort, and it hadn't saved me from loss. But one Sunday, Claire came over unannounced. She looked around the living room as if expecting to find a stranger hiding behind the couch. "Mom," she said, "I heard you've been spending a lot of time with that man from church, the one with the gray car. Thomas, right?" I nodded. "Yes, that's right." "He's been kind," she frowned. "Kind isn't the same as trustworthy. I know what people say, Mom. I just don't want you to regret this." I could feel the patience in her voice starting to thin, and something in me broke a little. "Claire," I said softly, "you spend your whole life telling your children to be brave, to open their hearts. And then when you do the same thing yourself, suddenly it's foolish." Her expression softened, but only a little. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Mom. I just don't want someone else to." "I know," I said, "but if I spend the rest of my life avoiding hurt, I'll never live." "You understand that, don't you?" She didn't answer. She kissed my cheek, said she had to go, and left before I could say anything else. That night, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on, one by one. The house was still, the kind of quiet that almost feels alive. I thought about how people see older women, as if our lives end after 60, as if the heart stops wanting things just because the mirror changes. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I just wanted to feel connected again, to something, to someone. Thomas kept showing up, steady as always. He'd bring flowers sometimes, not the expensive kind, just small wildflowers from his garden. Once he surprised me with a second-hand book he said reminded him of me. "Strong woman, soft heart." he said with that little grin. And yet, I started noticing small things, moments that didn't sit quite right. A call he ignored when we were together, a story about his job that changed slightly each time he told it. He'd get quiet if I asked too many questions, saying, "You don't have to worry about that, Maggie." I wanted to believe it was nothing, that everyone has small inconsistencies, that not everything needed to be dissected. But then came the day he mentioned borrowing a little money, just until next week. It was for his truck, he said, something about a repair he hadn't expected. It was only $50, and he seemed embarrassed to ask, so I gave it to him. When he didn't bring it up again, I told myself not to overthink it. After all, hadn't Henry and I helped neighbors before? Hadn't kindness always been my way of showing love? But a quiet unease started to grow. It wasn't loud or sharp. It was something slower, like the sound of a clock ticking in another room. You don't notice it until suddenly it's all you can hear. Still, I told myself to have faith, because even if Thomas wasn't perfect, he had given me something my family never could, a chance to feel like a woman again, not just a mother or a widow. And for a while, that was enough. I clung to the feeling, knowing deep down that maybe it wouldn't last, but wanting to believe it would. Because the truth is, sometimes hope feels easier than suspicion. And for a woman like me, who'd spent a lifetime putting others first, hope was a habit that died hard. I didn't know it yet, but the cracks I tried to ignore were about to widen. And everything I thought I'd learned about love, trust and dignity would soon be tested in a way I never expected. It didn't happen all at once. It was a dozen small things stacked on top of each other, until the pile felt too heavy to carry. The first was the money. He asked for $50 one Tuesday, saying his truck needed a part to get through the week. "I'll pay you back next Friday," he said. And I believed him because I've always believed people when they look you in the eye and sound almost ashamed to be asking. I handed him the cash like I'd handed him my time and company, without measuring the cost. Friday came and went. Then another Friday. When I asked, he made an excuse about a delayed check. The voice that once told me stories about his days at the hardware store now sounded small and tired, and I found myself waiting on the porch for a knock that didn't come. I told myself not to be petty. I told myself that kindness shouldn't have a ledger. But the truth is, the ledger gets written whether you know it or not. Every unpaid favor is a small tally that presses at the back of your heart. There were other things. He would promise to come to the little concert at the church and then forget. He'd mention lunch plans and then call from a different part of town, saying he'd been held up. He missed my niece's recital without so much as a text. Each absence felt like a little erosion, a slow tide pulling away at something that had seemed solid. When he did show up, his apologies were smooth and well-phrased, like a rehearsed line meant to soothe, not to show regret. I began to notice that his attention arrived in pieces, enough to make me think I imagined the rest was important. One afternoon, I was at the hardware store picking up potting soil when I saw him at the counter down the aisle, talking closely with a woman I didn't recognize. They were both laughing at something on her phone, their shoulders brushing. For a second, I felt foolish and exposed, as if I'd walked into a private photograph. I touched the bag of soil as if it were a shield and walked away slowly. He didn't see me. He never looked up. Later, he would tell me she was a volunteer at the pantry. "You worry too much, Maggie," he said when I asked. "She's just a friend." There are moments in life when a simple phrase reveals more than intended. "Just a friend," he said it with a casual ease that didn't sit right in my bones. The truth was, friendships aren't secretive in small towns. They live on porches and in church halls and at potlucks. If something had been more, I would have seen the footprints. I didn't shout. I didn't storm off. Instead, I walked home with my shopping list, feeling like a woman who'd been given a map with paths missing. I told myself to wait. I told myself to be honest, to ask plainly. But I had been a teacher for 32 years. Patience is a habit. I watched him for a while, noting the small inconsistencies like a teacher marking attendance. When I finally confronted him, it wasn't in the churchyard or a dramatic scene at the diner. It was in my kitchen, with a pot of stew simmering on the stove and the radio softly playing a song Henry used to hum. "Thomas," I said, folding a towel with hands that had ironed 1,000 shirts. "Are you seeing someone else?" My voice was steady because I wanted it to be. I wanted to test him without giving my heart away. He looked at me, surprised, like I'd asked him the most inconvenient of questions. "What? No, Maggie. I wouldn't do that." He set his hand on the back of a chair, fingers splayed like a man trying to find his place. "You know I care for you." "But I saw you with that woman at the store," I said. "And you borrowed money and never spoke of paying it back. I don't like being left with more questions than answers." His expression shifted in a way that felt practiced. "You're being unfair," he said softly. "I help people. Sometimes things happen. I'm not perfect." He put his palm on the counter, close to mine, as if that would bridge whatever had opened between us. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Those words could have been the end of it. I could have let them be enough and pretended the worry was a passing cloud. But something in me had already changed. The part that had been so eager to believe was also the part that kept score. It remembers the small kindnesses and the small unkindnesses, and it knows the difference. "I don't want excuses," I said. "I want honesty. If there's someone else, tell me. I'll be disappointed, yes, but I'll manage." He looked away then, and the fact that he couldn't meet my eyes felt impossible to ignore. "It's complicated," he mumbled. "You don't need to worry about it." That was when I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. This relationship wasn't going to be what I'd hoped. There was a comfort in knowing and a danger in pretending. I decided in that moment to stop pretending. I didn't need to make a scene. I didn't need dramatic closure. I simply needed to be honest with myself. The next Sunday, there was a church potluck that filled the fellowship hall with the smell of biscuits and baked ham. People milled about with paper plates, swapping recipes and condolences for last week's storm-damaged fences. Thomas arrived with a smile, but he stayed mostly near the back, chatting with someone I'd never met before, a woman whose laugh carried like a bell. He glanced at me as if to check that I was noting his presence, then returned to his conversation. I ate my mashed potatoes and watched him out of the corner of my eye, measuring his attentions as if they were signs on a road. After the potluck, as people were gathering their things, I walked up to him. We stood near the folding chairs, the room buzzing around us. "I think we should stop," I said, my voice low and calm. The words felt like a careful stitch, meant to repair a seam before it ripped. He blinked. "Stop?" he asked, as if he'd been given a puzzle without edges. "Yes," I said. "I don't want to be second best or an afterthought. I don't want to be someone you borrow from or forget in the middle of your day. I wanted companionship, not a rehearsal of loneliness." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Something like regret passed over his face, but it felt thin. "Maggie," he started. "No," I interrupted gently. "This isn't a performance for sympathy. It's an honest thing. I deserve straightforwardness." He reached for my hand as if to plead, but I pulled away, not in anger, but in a quiet, deliberate way. I didn't want his touch to be a habit I would miss. The hall smelled of lemon cleaner and wax, the sound of people folding chairs like distant thunder. Around us, life moved, unaware of the small, private ending taking place. He tried to explain, to tell me about pressures and misunderstandings, and for a moment, I felt the old inclination to listen and forgive. But listening is not the same as accepting patterns that chip away at your dignity. "I'll be all right," I told him finally. "You take care of yourself." I wanted to say more, ask why, demand the truth. But those questions would have been for me alone, not a thing to drag him back into the room. When I walked home, the sky was the pale blue that means autumn is close. The trees along the road were beginning to blush with color. I felt hollow and oddly relieved at the same time, a sensation I had not expected. Perhaps that's the strange grace of getting older. You learn to accept endings without drama, to let go with calm that is not resignation, but a quiet reclaiming of your own pace. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window with the radio low, and watched a bird hop along the fence. The house felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because there was no pretense left to maintain. Heavier because I was now carrying the weight of my own decisions alone. I told Claire the next day. She listened in silence, then sighed, and for the first time I heard in her voice a relief that I had expected to be selfish, like someone unlocking a door in the dark. "I'm sorry, Mom," she said. "I didn't want this for you." Her apology was soft, and we spoke then in a tone that had more tenderness than the arguments that had come before. She hugged me, brief and warm. "You did the right thing," she said. "I was just scared for you." There was no dramatic showdown at family dinners. Ruth made a remark about lessons learned, and then changed the subject to her neighbor's cat. People moved on the way small towns do. There's a current that pulls everyone back to ordinary life. But inside I felt a subtle recalibration. I had expected to be the one scolded for my choices, to be pitied or consoled. Instead, I found my own steady center where disappointment had tried to sit. In the weeks that followed, the mornings returned to their small, steady rituals. I weeded the garden with a kind of careful attention that felt like meditation. I mended a favorite sweater that had a hole in the elbow, sitting at my sewing table as a way to stitch together the frayed parts. I joined the book club more often, not to distract myself, but because I wanted the company of people who could speak about stories without needing something in return. The quiet that had followed Henry's death had been heavy, but this quiet felt different. It was chosen rather than imposed. I began to feel the space of my days with a new curiosity. I took a pottery class at the community center on Tuesdays, and although my first bowl came out lopsided and uneven, I found the process pleasing. I made phone calls to old friends I hadn't spoken to in years. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to plan small things that were only mine. A weekend trip to the coast with a friend. A new lamp for the reading nook. There wasn't a headline announcing my recovery. There were only small moments. A letter from a former student, a neighbor borrowing my ladder and returning it washed and neatly tied, the taste of toast with honey in the morning. I learned to enjoy the ordinary edges of my days without expecting them to be filled by someone else. The mistake I made, I realized, wasn't loving again. It was expecting a man to mend the empty places in me that never belonged to anyone but myself. That realization didn't come with theatrical bravado. It came like morning light, slow, perceptive, and warm. And with it came a kind of gentle freedom, knowing that my life was not a story to be completed by another person, but a book I could continue writing on my own. Still, the memory of Thomas lingered, not like a wound, but like a weathered photograph that you keep in a drawer. I didn't burn it or throw it away. I folded it carefully and put it where I could find it if I ever wanted to remember the lessons it taught me. The truth was clear. I would love again if love asked me, but I would not wait for someone else to give me a life I could build myself. And as the days moved forward, steady and ordinary, I found myself thinking of the lake I'd once driven past. Small cottages tucked among trees, a porch, a place to sit and read the afternoon away. I wasn't sure why the thought kept returning, but it planted itself in my mind like a seed. Maybe, I thought, there was more to come. A kind of beginning that didn't require permission. The bank smelled like paper and lemon polish. The kind of smell that always makes me think of long lines and polite nods. I go there more than I used to, paying bills and checking on things Henry and I had put in order over the years. That morning, the sunlight cut through the lobby and made little dust motes dance, and for a moment, I felt like the world was ordinary and safe. Then I remembered the umbrella at my door and the quietness that had followed Thomas. And ordinary didn't feel quite the same. I walked up to the teller like a woman who knows the forms by heart. "Good morning, Mrs. Hollis," she said, handing me a stapled receipt with a practiced smile. I answered, neutered the small talk, and then, when there was a lull and a privacy window rolled down like a curtain, I asked the question that had been there for days. "I'd like to withdraw some from my savings." The account had a name on it that always made me feel Henry was still sitting at my elbow. Maggie and Henry Hollis, for things we want. It had been Henry's joke when he signed the paperwork, like a little promise we had tucked away against the day we wanted a new tire or a trip to the coast. After the funeral, people had come to the house with casseroles and sympathy, and so many small kindnesses that I'd hardly noticed the savings growing quietly. Henry had told me once, not long before he got sick. If there's ever something you want to make your own, Maggie, don't ask anyone's permission. He said it like it was a small rebellious act. Then he laughed and fixed the leaky sink. I'd tucked that sentence into my pocket and kept it there like a coin. Now, in the bank, I told the teller the amount. "All right, Mrs. Hollis," she said, and boxes were ticked. A signature swirled in a brisk, efficient hand. I folded the cash into my purse and felt a peculiar mixture of guilt and relief. It wasn't a fortune, not by any measure. It was the little nest egg Henry and I had saved for something that would make me happy. For a while, I'd imagined it as a trip with Thomas, a gentle indulgence that would be shared. Now the thought of sharing with him felt wrong in a way that tightened my throat. Driving away from town, I kept switching the radio stations like someone searching for a word. The road out of Asheville opens up into those ribbons of green that roll toward the lake country, maples and oaks leaning over narrow lanes, farmhouses tucked into hollows. I turn the wheel on impulse, letting the car carry me where the day seems softer. There's a part of me that is shy about bold moves. I teach cautious steps and lesson plans. But there's another part of me that remembers Henry climbing onto the roof to fix a loose shingle and smiling like it was an adventure. Maybe the two parts are allowed to share the same afternoon. The drive smells like cut grass and sour apples. I pass the place where the mailboxes stand in a line like small sentries, a spot where kids once stopped to trade baseball cards. I slow down at a bend and see, beyond a stand of pines, the slanted gray roof of a cottage blinking in the sun like something held close. There's a for sale sign, hand-lettered and slightly lopsided, and my heart makes a small, foolish skip. I pull into the gravel driveway before I even know what I'm doing. The cottage sits by the edge of a small lake, not the big kind with boats and booms, but the sort that holds light like a bowl, clear and shallow and honest. It's got clapboard siding weathered to a soft silver, a porch with a sagging step, and windows that look like they've seen storms and small joys in equal measure. Someone has planted marigolds by the steps and let them grow wild. The whole thing looks less like a house, and more like a memory that's been waiting for someone to remember it. A realtor appears before I can even knock. A woman with sensible shoes and a clipboard who looks at me with the wide, assessing eyes reserved for people who might sign dotted lines. "Hello," she says, like she's been expecting me. "You came on a good day. Would you like to look around?" I follow her through the screen door that sticks just a little in the afternoon heat. The inside smells of lemon oil and something older, wood polish and the faint, sweet scent of sun-warmed quilts. The living room is small and warm, with a crooked fireplace and a bookcase full of well-thumbed volumes. There's a chair that looks like it's been mended with love and a small table covered with a crocheted doily. Light filters through the curtains and makes patterns on the floor like lace. This place has been on the market for a while, the realtor says as she points out the original hardwood floors and the sturdy stone foundation. Her voice is practical. It's got good bones. Needs some work, of course, but it's solid. Her eyebrows lift like she's waiting to see if I can imagine the work. I imagine it without effort. The pale yellow paint on the porch, a row of lavender along the walk, a little reading nook by the window with a soft blanket and a stack of new books. I imagine myself sitting there with a cup of tea, a cat tucked under the windowsill if the cat is willing. I picture Henry's laugh in the corner of my mind, not intruding but kept like a photograph. "How much?" I ask. She tells me a number that is less than my nest egg, but not by a wide margin. It's enough to cause the accountant in me to do her cautious math, to plan and plot and consider contingencies. But the part of me that has been tired of calculating other people's expectations leans forward and whispers, "You'll be all right, Maggie." I nod. There's a kind of courage in deciding that your life will be full on your terms. The signing happens in a sunlit office behind the town's small courthouse. The papers are formal and brisk as a handshake. The realtor asks with a gentle smile, "Are you sure you want to do this alone?" I laugh at that question, at the way it's framed like a concern when it's really an offer of company. "That's exactly why I'm doing it," I say. It feels good to say it aloud. The sentence lands in the room and makes a small sound, like a bell. The woman's face softens with a smile that is part admiration and part relief that someone else made the leap she had been waiting to see. Driving the little car back toward town with a folded contract in my lap, I feel the world tilt in a new friendly direction. I stop at a diner and order a piece of cherry pie that I don't share. The waiter brings it with an extra dollop of cream like an unasked-for blessing, and I let the sweetness sit on my tongue longer than usual. For once, the dessert is symbolic and literal, small and utterly mine. When I tell Claire, I do it over the phone while I am still sitting in the car with the engine cooling under a sycamore's shade. Her reaction is a mixture of worry and a slow, dawning pride that catches me off guard. "Mom?" she says, and there's humidity in her voice, like the way rain softens a harsh line. "Are you certain?" "It's a big step. It's my step," I answer simply. "Henry told me once to buy something that would make me happy. I'm using my own money to do that. I don't need permission." She is silent for a moment, and then she laughs a little, like someone finding a path on a map they thought they'd lost. "Okay," she says. "If anyone can make a cottage a home, you can. Just promise me you'll be careful and call me when you get there." I promise, and I mean it. The promise is both to her and to myself. I promise to be sensible, to hire a reliable plumber and not climb onto roofs if I can help it, to keep the heating serviced. But there's more in the promise than practicalities. There's a promise to live by the rule Henry left in Half a Joke, that you don't always need a reason to take a joy when it chooses you. Over the next few weeks, the house becomes a project that feels like a conversation between me and a place. I sand the porch stairs with careful strokes, finding the rhythm I once used when I taught children how to write their names. I paint the kitchen a soft buttercup yellow that makes everything seem kinder. I hang curtains that flutter when the window is open, and plant a small row of herbs by the sill because fresh rosemary makes a soup feel like a holiday. There are people who stop and offer help, and there are people who watch with thin smiles and folded arms. I let both kinds of attention wash over me, and do not care which one lingers. The first night I sleep there, I stand by the window and listen to the lake breathe. It makes a slow sound like an old clock. I think of Henry and his careful steadiness, and I tell him quietly, as if speaking into a room, that I did as he suggested. I did something that made me happy. There is no triumphant parade or grand announcement. Instead, there is a mailbox with my name on it, and a small stack of invoices to sort through, and a neighbor who knocks to borrow a cup of sugar and leaves 2 fresh eggs in return. It is domestic and ordinary and perfect in the way that matters. As the days fill with small tasks, fixing a leaky faucet, choosing the perfect lamp, finding a place for the rocking chair I'd always thought was too early for, there is a new feeling taking root. It is not a loud, angry thing. It is gentle and persistent, the kind of hope that shows up as a steady pulse at the wrist. I am building something that will outlast a disappointment, something that is stitched together with my own hands and Henry's quiet advice. When someone asks later why I did it, I will say simply, because I wanted a place that belonged to me. For now, as the afternoon light falls across the porch and the marigolds lean into it, I know the decision was right because my chest feels lighter and my steps a little more sure. The house waits for me with rooms that will soon hold stories, some of them mine, some of them shared with friends, and some that have not been written yet. When I finally carried the last box into the little lake cottage, the air smelled like fresh paint and pine needles. The realtor had left the key in an envelope on the counter with a handwritten note that simply said, "Welcome home, Mrs. Hollis." The words felt bigger than the paper they were written on. For the first time in years, I stood in a space that was entirely my own. No ghosts of the past watching from corners, no voices reminding me to check in or compromise. Just me, the steady hum of cicadas outside, and the slow creak of floorboards under my feet. I didn't have much to move in with. A few boxes of books, some dishes, Henry's old reading chair, and a small collection of framed photographs that had followed me from one home to another. When I set the chair down by the window and hung Henry's photograph on the wall, it didn't feel like I was clinging to the past anymore. It felt like I was honoring it, carrying the good parts forward without dragging the pain along too. That first night, I made a pot of soup and ate it by candlelight, because the power hadn't been turned on yet. The flame flickered against the yellow walls, and the lake outside was a black mirror, perfectly still. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that presses down on you. This silence felt alive, like it was waiting to see what I would do with it. I remember sitting there, hands wrapped around the bowl and whispering softly, "I'm okay now, Henry. I really am." The next morning I opened all the windows and let the sunlight pour in. I painted the walls a soft pale yellow that made the whole house feel like morning, even when the day was gray. The paintbrush moved in slow, steady strokes, and every time I finished a wall, it felt like I was reclaiming another piece of myself. I played old records while I worked, Etta James, Nina Simone, a few country songs Henry used to hum, and the sound filled the empty rooms in a way that made them feel warm, lived in and mine. I planted roses by the porch, just like my mother used to. They were stubborn things at first, dry roots and thorns that fought me at every turn, but I talked to them the way I used to talk to my students when they struggled. "You'll get there," I said, patting the soil down around them. "You just need time." By the end of the week, they'd already started to perk up, tiny green shoots reaching toward the light. Inside, I turned the spare bedroom into a sewing nook. I hadn't sewn in years, not since before Henry passed. My machine was dusty, the kind you have to wind by hand before it hums to life. But it still worked. I found fabric at a little thrift shop in town, faded florals, soft plaids, and started making curtains for the windows. The rhythm of the needle, the soft pull of thread between my fingers, it all felt familiar, like something my body remembered before my mind did. It was quiet work, but deeply satisfying. I didn't need anyone to tell me it looked nice. I could see it, feel it. Every day had its own rhythm. Morning coffee on the porch with the sound of birds dipping through the trees. Afternoons spent sanding an old dresser I'd found by the roadside. Evenings where I'd sit by the lake with a book and watch the sky fade from gold to violet. There were no deadlines, no expectations, just the steady unfolding of a life that belonged to me. Of course, Claire didn't understand it at first. She came to visit a few weeks after I moved in, driving up the gravel path with her usual mix of love and concern. When she stepped out of the car, her eyes darted over the cottage like she was inspecting it for safety. "It's smaller than I thought," she said, trying to sound polite. "It's perfect," I answered. "It fits me just right." Inside, she looked around like she was waiting for something to fall apart. "You painted the walls yourself?" she asked, touching the edge of the doorway. "I did. Took me 2 days and a very sore shoulder." She smiled faintly, but I could see the worry still sitting behind her eyes. "Mom, I just want you to be okay out here. By yourself." "I am," I said simply. "I've never felt more okay." She sat with me at the kitchen table for a while. I poured her coffee and brought out a plate of shortbread cookies I'd baked that morning. We talked about the kids, her work, little things. She kept glancing around like she was trying to find something wrong, some sign of loneliness I hadn't admitted to her. But there wasn't any. There was peace in every corner of that little house. She just didn't know how to see it yet. When she left, she hugged me tighter than usual. "You really seem happy," she said, almost surprised. "I am," I told her. "It's different, but it's good. It's quiet, but not empty." And I meant it. The silence of this house wasn't the same kind of silence that had followed me after Henry died. That silence had been hollow, full of echoes and grief. This silence was gentle, filled with life's small sounds. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the creak of floorboards when I walked barefoot, the rustle of wind through the pine trees outside. It wasn't lonely anymore. It was mine. After Claire's visit, something shifted. She didn't call as often to check if I was managing. Instead, she'd call just to talk. Sometimes she'd ask about the roses or the lake or what book I was reading that week. Once, she even brought the kids for the weekend, and we spent an afternoon baking pies and skipping stones on the water. I watched her watching me, and for the first time I could see she understood. This wasn't me running away from life. It was me stepping back into it. The neighbors came around too, in that kind of slow, southern way where no one rushes introductions. A woman named Janice from down the road brought me a basket of peaches and said, "We've all been watching you fix this place up. You've done wonders with it." I laughed, telling her I was still learning where the light switches were, and she said, "That's the best kind of learning there is." I started inviting people over now and then, not out of loneliness, but because I wanted to share what I was building. A few women from the church came for tea one Saturday, and one of them looked around and said, "Maggie, this place feels like a hug." That might have been the best compliment I've ever been given. Still, most days I preferred the quiet. I liked hearing my own thoughts, the way they softened when there wasn't anyone else to answer to. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch swing in the evenings with a blanket over my knees, watching the lake catch the last bit of light. I'd think about all the versions of myself I'd been. The teacher, the wife, the widow, the woman who thought she needed someone to make her feel alive again. Now, I was just me. That was enough. I stopped checking my phone so much. I stopped waiting for calls or invitations or anyone's approval. I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. The way the light curved across the kitchen in the morning. The smell of the roses when it rained. The taste of honey on toast when the day was new. Those small things became the rhythm of my life. Once in a while, Thomas would cross my mind, like a name in an old yearbook. Not with anger or bitterness, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had been part of my story, and I had learned something from him. Love, I realized, wasn't the mistake. Waiting for someone else to fill the spaces in my life, that was the mistake. I could love again, maybe one day, but it would have to begin from wholeness, not from need. When the evening stretched long, I would take out my sewing kit and work on little projects. Curtains, table runners, a quilt that would probably take me all winter. The sound of the needle and the steady rhythm of stitching felt like a heartbeat. Each pull of thread reminded me that healing doesn't happen in one grand gesture. It happens in hundreds of small, patient ones. By the time autumn arrived, the roses by the porch had bloomed full and red, their scent mixing with the crisp air. The cottage looked exactly as I'd imagined it when I first saw it from the road. Old, weathered, and perfect. When I walked through it, I could hear laughter again. But this time, it wasn't for anyone else. It was for me. Quiet, contented laughter that rose from somewhere deep and honest. I didn't need to tell anyone that I was happy. I didn't need to explain or defend the choices I'd made. I just lived them, day by day, moment by moment. And as I did, I realized something simple but powerful. Peace doesn't always come from forgiveness or closure, or even love. Sometimes, it comes from finally choosing yourself. That's what this house had given me. A space to be myself without apology. A place where I could wake up each morning, look out at the lake, and feel grateful not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd finally found. And in that quiet, golden light that fell across the pale yellow walls, I knew this wasn't the ending of my story. It was the beginning of the part I'd been too afraid to write. The lake is shallow where I like to sit, the kind of place where the water holds the color of the sky without arguing. I come here most evenings now. A little ritual I didn't know I needed until it became mine. Tonight the sun is low and generous, pouring gold across the water and making the trees look like somebody painted them with quiet hands. I sit on the little bench by the dock, my hands folded over a warmed mug, and I let the light do its easy work on my face. It feels like a soft answer to a question I've been asking myself for years. Am I all right? There are things you expect to feel when you make a change in your life. Pride, maybe, or a strange flutter of fear. But I didn't know how full the quieter feelings could be. There's a steady satisfaction, the kind you get from mending a hem that keeps a child's favorite blanket in use for another season. There's a restful surprise, the kind that enters quietly, like a cat curling against your knee when you're bent over a book. Sometimes there's a little sharpness, too. When I remember the way Thomas smiled and imagined generosity he did not always mean. But mostly there's a warmth that lives deep and even. And tonight the warmth is a kind of company. It's been months since I moved into the cottage. The roses are taller than I expected, bold and nearly stubborn in their bloom. The curtains I sewed hang like promises I made to myself and kept. The porch swing still creaks in the same sweet way it did the first week I nailed it back into place. And sometimes I sit there at dawn just to see how the light wakes the water. All the small decisions I made, paint color, a new lamp, the placement of Henry's photograph, have added up into a life that feels like something I own rather than something loaned to me. Ownership is a gentle thing when you get to this age. It's not flashy. It's reliable. A good bedrock. Family has a way of circling back, sometimes like a tide, sometimes like migrating birds that find their way home. Claire came more often than she used to. When she first visited after I moved, her eyes swept the cottage the way someone inspects an unfamiliar room for things that might break. Over time, the scrutiny softened into curiosity. She started asking about the roses and which neighbor had the best blueberry pie recipe. Once she surprised me by bringing over her little ones and staying for 2 full nights. We baked and read stories and watched the kids run until the world felt simpler for them and for me. Her change of heart wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with speeches or apologies. It came slowly, the way trust does when it's being rebuilt, in small actions and steadier presence. One afternoon, she helped me hang a new shelf in the sewing nook. We worked in companionable silence for a while, and then she said, as if she'd just discovered a fact she'd been meaning to accept, "You look peaceful here. I like seeing you like this." I told her then that the peace didn't come from proving anyone wrong. It was something I had chosen for myself. She hugged me and said, "I'm proud of you, Mom." And that felt more necessary than any argument ever could. Ruth, bless her, was slower to come around. She kept her teasing, of course, because teasing is the way she speaks affection. But one day she stopped by with a casserole and a basket of cuttings for the garden. She squinted at the rose bushes, shook her head the way she always did when something surprised her, and muttered, "Well, you've done all right here." It was a small concession, and I watched her retreat down the walk with her shoulders just a little less guarded than before. People in town started to nod differently when I passed them on the main street. Some of that was curiosity. Some of it was the slow, generous respect the community has for someone who chooses a life without drama. The church ladies brought over lemon bars one Sunday and stayed to gaze out at the lake, as if they were seeing something they liked. The hardware man waved and asked if I needed help with the porch. The librarian recommended a new author. Small kindnesses pile up into ordinary grace. There were moments the old ache surfaced, of course. I would find myself reaching for the phone to call Henry and then remember the gentle rhythm of the house when he wasn't here. I'd open a drawer and find a pen he favored, and smile at the mark his thumb made on the cap. Those memories are soft and real. They aren't things I push away. They're the roots that help the house feel like home, the way roots keep a tree steady in wind. I don't talk about Henry like he's gone forever because he's not. He's in the waltz of things that formed me, in the way I fold napkins, or the stories I tell the kids at school events. One evening, I walked down to the little dock just before sunset, and there was Claire, fishing pole in hand, looking like she'd always belonged to this place. She smiled when she saw me, and for the first time I thought I could read the peace in her face as plainly as my own reflection on the water. "You were right," she said, as I sat next to her, and we watched the bobber bob. "Not about the man necessarily, but about how you wanted to live. I see it now." I squeezed her hand, and the small squeeze between us felt like a bridge. It's strange sometimes, how people expect revenge to look like a shout. That's the storybook's version. Dramatic confrontations, public humiliation, a pointed, satisfying end. My revenge, if you can call it that, was quieter, and to me, truer. It wasn't about proving my family wrong with a parade or a public renunciation. It was about building a life so honest and complete that the only proof anyone needed was my contentment. I took what people thought would be my weakness, age, solitude, the whispers of too old, and turned it into the foundation of something I'd always been too polite to claim. There were times when people would say, with thinly veiled pity, "Oh, you did that alone?" As if doing it alone were a sad thing. I understood the impulse. We're raised to think of partnership as the ideal. But there's a dignity to choosing solitude for the right reasons. Choosing to be alone because you are full of yourself, not because you are empty, is an act of self-respect. That, I've learned, is a finer sort of revenge than bitterness. I found new rhythms that suited me. Morning tea on the porch, a stroll to the market on Thursdays, potluck at the church on second Sundays. I taught a short writing workshop at the community center, and the kids who came asked the best questions. They wanted to know what I love most about being a teacher. I told them that love was a kind of patience, and that you get to decide who you are at least once in your life. They nodded like it was the best secret they'd heard all week. There were also friendships that surprised me. Neighbors who had been casual acquaintances became confidants. We traded jars of jam and stories about our parents. We sat on the porch and argued lightly about whether the rain forecast meant the tomatoes should be covered. Those small human interactions made evenings full, in a way that didn't need romance to feel complete. I still think about Thomas sometimes, not with bitterness, but as part of my education. He taught me something without meaning to, that not all kindness is steady, and that hearts can be generous in parts and reckless in others. I don't hold him responsible for my choices. I'm responsible for them. That thought gives me a kind of freedom I wouldn't trade for anything. As the sun slips lower this evening, the water is a sheet of burnt orange. The dock makes a brittle sound under my feet when I shift my weight, and a pair of geese honk in the distance, their flight slow and sure. I breathe in the air that smells faintly of pine and someone's distant barbecue, and feel the world fit me like a hand in a familiar glove. My face is lined now, the map of the life I've lived, and it feels honorable. I stand up from the bench and walk back toward the cottage. The windows glow like lanterns, warm and inviting. Through the glass I can see the faint outline of the sewing nook, the pale yellow walls catching the last light. I think of how many nights I sat wondering if choosing myself was selfish. I think now that it was the opposite. Choosing yourself, when it's done with respect and tenderness, is the most unselfish act there is, because it leaves you whole enough to love others without needing them to complete you. When I step inside, the house seems to welcome me like an old friend. The kettle is already steaming on the stove because I like a cup before bed, and the radio hums softly with a song that makes me smile. I hang my coat and take a slow breath, the kind that goes all the way down to the place that holds peace. I cross to the window, look out over the lake one more time, and whisper, not like anyone else is listening. They said I was too old to love again. But they were right. I was too old to keep waiting for someone else to give it to me. That's the line I say now when someone asks why I did it. It isn't meant to be clever or to sting. It's a simple truth. Age is not an expiration date. It's a catalog of the ways we learn how to live with honesty. I found something quieter than revenge. I found myself. If this little story of mine touches you, if it stirs something gentle in your chest, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more stories like this. And if you feel moved, drop a comment below. Even one word is enough to say you are here. Tell me where you're watching from or what time it is where you are. Those small connections are what make stories live.